What happened here on February 1st, 1922, has been the subject of numerous books and retellings, and each one of them has different theories and different speculations. But before it gets too complicated and messy, here is what everyone agrees on and what is considered to be factual. At 7 p.m., Mabel Normand's chauffeur pulled right up here on Alvarado Street. He waited in the car while Mabel went to the northeast corner bungalow, Billy's bungalow. Billy's assistant, or his personal valet, as they were called back then, Henry Peavy, recalled opening the door to let Mabel in at 7. Henry recalled that he had taken care of everything, that Mr. Taylor had been fed and all of his clothes were ready for the next day. Mr. Taylor had given him permission to go home, and he said goodbye to Mr. Taylor and Miss Normand and headed home. Being an important director meant that Billy had access to alcohol. He made himself and Mabel a gin cocktail and presented her with her new literary gift. The two spent less than an hour together when Mabel left at 7:45. It was February, which meant it was now dark, so Billy, the gentleman, escorted her out of his apartment, leaving his front door wide open. It was really only a short walk to Mabel's waiting automobile. Billy saw Mabel safely to her car. He said goodnight to the chauffeur, and before he got back to his apartment, he turned one last time to blow Mabel a kiss. She caught it and threw one back. It would be the last time they would ever see each other alive. 16 beautiful units, spread out among 8 two-story buildings, sat on this property. Douglas and Fait MacLean, both early 30s, lived in one of them. Douglas is considered to be a long-forgotten comedy great. He had recently starred in 2 films directed by Taylor, also starring Mary Pickford. They had just finished eating dinner when Doug went upstairs to light the heater. At about 7:50, Faith heard a shockingly loud sound. Now, cars back then, they were known for backfiring, which would create a very loud, piercing shot. Living on Alvarado Street, this was fairly common, but still, this noise was loud enough for the MacLean's housekeeper to enter the kitchen to see what the heck the sound was. Faith, she got up from the kitchen table and went to her front door. Upon opening it, she said she was met with the bright lights from the courtyard's lampposts, so she pressed her face and hands to the screen door to get a better look. On Taylor's front porch, just inches from his wide-open front door, she saw a man, and the man was looking directly at her. She said he had on a long coat, his collar was up, and he had a muffler around his neck. He also had a cap on, with the front tilted down to the eyebrows, as if to conceal his face. What wasn't concealed, though, was the man's mouth. As he saw Faith staring at him, his mouth formed a smile. Faith could see that, but not much else. She said he was somewhere around 5'9", stocky. She said the only thing she found peculiar about him was that he was dressed like her idea of a, quote, motion picture burglar. Other than that, he was as cool as a cucumber. He simply turned to Taylor's door, stepped inside as if he were just casually saying goodbye to William. He pulled the door closed and walked towards Maryland Avenue into the shadows of the night. Faith, she really truly didn't think anything of it. When Douglas came down, he acknowledged he too had heard the loud sound, but they shrugged it off as another car backfiring and played dominoes at the kitchen table until they decided to go to bed. At about 10 after 8, Howard Fellows, Taylor's personal chauffeur, not to be confused with Henry Peavy, his valet, returned with Taylor's car. He had driven Taylor around all day, including the run to Robinson's for Mabel's book, and he was returning to lock the automobile up in Taylor's garage. He noticed the lights were still on inside the home, so with the car idling in the alley, he knocked on Taylor's front door. There was no answer, so he locked the car up. He tried one last time, thinking perhaps Taylor would open the door this time. He just assumed Taylor was busy or perhaps had fallen asleep early with the lights on, so he headed down Alvarado to catch the bus home and figured he would just see his boss when he returned the following day. 12 hours after he said goodbye to Mabel Normand and Mr. Taylor, Henry Peavy, Taylor's valet, not chauffeur, was en route back to the bungalow to start another day of work here. He was especially eager and anxious to arrive today, not because he loved working for Taylor so much, but because today was an extremely important day for Peavy. You see, he was gay, and every single book, every single document will make sure that you know that. He is always described as being extremely effeminate, flamboyant, eccentric. They say he swished, they say he swayed, they say his hands flailed. They'll tell you he wore bright, fancy clothes, but what they'll also say is that he didn't hide it. Love that. But it was 1922, and you did have to hide your actions, and since there were basically no dating options for gay men back then, they took to the parks and would go cruising for other gay men. Henry Peavy had recently been arrested for doing just this. Following his arrest, William Desmond Taylor stepped up and bailed him out. Taylor also agreed to appear in court on Peavy's behalf on this very morning. With someone as distinguished and as reputable as Mr. Taylor standing next to Peavy in front of a judge, he was sure to get off the hook. However, their appearance in court together was not meant to be. Peavy arrived back here at 7:30. His routine would be to get Mr. Taylor's breakfast ready before he woke up and came downstairs. This time, Taylor was already downstairs, but there would be no breakfast. Peavy let himself into the bungalow and discovered William Desmond Taylor laying on the floor, face up, immaculately dressed, but lifeless. He ran over to Taylor, and upon discovering that he was dead, he ran back out to the courtyard here, screaming, "He's dead! Mr. Taylor is dead! Call the police!" No one can hear me. These frantic, piercing screams, they were heard from every bungalow, and every tenant who was home checked to see what the hell was going on. And from this moment on, a perfect storm of chaos ensued, so messy that 100 years later, people are still trying to make sense of it. The residents of the Alvarado Court bungalows were scrambling. Two male tenants, along with Douglas MacLean, ran into Taylor's apartment. Fait MacLean then joined. They all agreed that Taylor looked like a department store mannequin, laying perfectly flat, feet up, arms neatly at his side, and his clothes perfectly straightened out. Now, Douglas MacLean, he wasn't the only screen star living in the bungalow courtyard. Remember Edna Purviance, whose name was on the Chase Bank wall we saw earlier? Well, she was an actress who appeared in over 30 films as Charlie Chaplin's leading lady. She was sitting at her second-story window listening to the goings-on downstairs. When it was made clear that Taylor was in fact dead, she knew she had someone to call, her very dear friend Mabel Normand. However, that wasn't the only phone call she would make, and in fact, several phone calls were made from several different people. Great, more rain. Within minutes, William Desmond Taylor's bungalow was swarming with people. Harry Fellows, the chauffeur, had been called by Henry the valet. Taylor's frequent screenwriter and her cameraman son showed up, a handful of Taylor's friends, and finally a detective with the LAPD. He noticed no visible forced entry, all the windows were locked, and Henry Peavy flat out said that nothing from the apartment seemed to be missing, and nothing at all was in disarray. The empty cocktail glasses that Mabel and Billy had been drinking from the night before, they were really the only signs that anyone had been active in the apartment. The detective saw no reason for foul play, so he continued to let everyone mill about the place. Not only that, but Taylor's watch was still on his wrist, and he had close to $80 in his pocket, so it certainly did not appear that robbery was the motive. Taylor's bungalow was right here on this corner. We're standing in the alleyway that still runs where his alleyway did, and Suddenly, a doctor appeared amidst the chaos. The place was only getting tighter and tighter with everyone running around, and this doctor declared that Taylor had died from a stomach hemorrhage. Henry Peavy chimed in saying, yeah, Taylor did indeed ask him to get some milk of magnesia because he had been complaining about an upset stomach. And then the entire dynamic shifts when Charles Eaton enters the bungalow. Charles was the general manager at famous Players Lasky, and believe it or not, back then, the police department kind of let important movie people call the shots, and that's what happened in this case. Eaton started running the show, and the detective simply stepped aside because everyone knew the film industry was the most important industry in town. Eaton, too, didn't think that there had been any foul play, but now suddenly the press was showing up, and the film industry was suffering greatly from the Fatty Arbuckle trial. They couldn't afford another scandal. And even though it seemed like Taylor had died from natural causes, Eaton didn't want the press seeing anything that could be considered scandalous. He knew and even employed a handful of those people running around in the living room, so he instructed them to ransack Taylor's apartment, collecting anything that the press could use against the currently troubled film community. They did as he asked, and finally, around 9 o'clock, a full 90 minutes after Henry Peavy had discovered Taylor's lifeless body, the LA coroner showed up. He had been told that Taylor died from a stomach hemorrhage, but after all, he had final ruling. However, he knew that he couldn't make a formal conclusion until he got Taylor's body down to the morgue. Giving Taylor's body a quick once-over, the coroner placed his hand under Taylor's back. As he withdrew it, everyone saw that it was covered with blood. Yeah, a stomach hemorrhage, he sarcastically said to everyone. He asked for Charles Eaton's assistance in turning Taylor over, and when the two men had him on his side, they lifted Taylor's vest and shirt and discovered a .38 caliber bullet hole in Taylor's side. The detective finally got some balls, and he yelled out that the apartment was officially a crime scene, and with the help of a few police officers who had shown up during the chaos, had everyone removed from the bungalow. Not without a fight, however. Once reporters and neighbors got wind that there had been a murder, all hell broke loose. Reporters were climbing through Taylor's windows, sneaking upstairs. Neighbors were trying to get their names in the papers by giving accounts of what they suddenly remember seeing and hearing. It was a zoo, and the press was about to have a field day. America, seriously, could not get enough of this story, and the filmmaking world would really never be the same again. William Desmond Taylor was laid to rest on February 7th, 5 days after his murder. His service was held at St. Paul's Pro Cathedral downtown on Figueroa Street, which was demolished in 1980 to make way for a 50-story office building. His body was then brought here to the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, and it was a scene. During those 5 days, newspapers just couldn't be printed fast enough. People were absolutely hooked. For the first time in weeks, the Fatty Arbuckle case had been knocked off the front page. The papers reported that between his church service downtown and the funeral here, 30,000 people turned out to catch a glimpse of the film community bidding farewell to the beloved director. In addition to the fans and spectators, really the entire industry came here to pay their respects. You'd really be hard-pressed to find any of Taylor's colleagues or actors say a bad word about him. Everyone said he was more than a director, he was their friend. Or in Ethel Daisy's case, her father. The now 19-year-old had been recently reunited with her long-lost father, and how it all came about is just bonkers. In 1914, when she was 11, she and her mom, Ethel May, went to see Captain Alvarez. When the film's star, William Desmond Taylor, appeared on screen, the two caused a scene. "That's your father," Ethel May blurted out. I mean, they were going crazy. So much was racing through their minds, but the biggest question was, who's William Desmond Taylor? Ethel May had married a William Cunningham Dean Tanner. I mean, can you imagine? It's not like you can go home and look him up online. Who do you call? Where do you even go? Well, eventually, Ethel Daisy started writing letters to her father, and he responded. The two corresponded over the years, leading up to him sending her money and gifts, but it wasn't until his return trip from Europe the summer before he died that he stopped in New York to see Ethel Daisy, over a decade since he had last laid eyes on her. He really wanted to make up for lost time and be there for her as a father, and it appeared that their relationship was heading in a great direction until his shocking death. I mean, it's clear by his grave marker here that the two were in a good place. Someone's even left him a flower. Anyway, Ethel Daisy and her mom were both very cooperative with the press and very cooperative with investigators, and they were never considered suspects. Also, though, Taylor never offered an explanation to either of them why he disappeared and changed his name, but really, neither of them had a strong enough grudge against him. It's not like they needed his money. Ethel May's family had plenty, and she was even remarried now to the owner of Delmonico's Steakhouse in New York, which still exists today. Ironically, though, Taylor had a younger brother who also left his wife and child. William Taylor felt bad, perhaps even guilty about his own choices, so he found his sister-in-law and her kid out in Monrovia, California. He ended up helping them financially, but the truth is, when it came to the list of suspects, nobody on that list was even related to William Dean Cunningham Tanner. Now that this was a murder case, Los Angeles District Attorney Thomas Woolwine needed someone he could trust to lead this investigation. He was about to run for governor of California, so he wanted it solved and closed as quickly as possible. He ended up choosing Sergeant Edgar King, a 46-year-old cop with an impeccable record. King had the most solved cases of any cop in LA history. He also got right to work. As soon as Taylor's body left Alvarado Street, it was examined, and he determined that the bullet, which had entered Taylor's left side, about 6 inches below his left armpit, had traveled up through his lung, through his chest, eventually lodging into his neck. When the bullet was retrieved, it was discovered that it had been fired from a .38 caliber gun. It was also determined that the gun had to have been an inch or less away from Taylor's body when it was fired, most likely meaning Taylor was in an embrace. Now, this would explain why the bullet hole on Taylor's body didn't line up with the bullet hole on his clothing, meaning that at the point of entry, his arms were raised. They also said he could have been sitting at his desk with someone approaching him from behind saying, stick him up. But as far as suspects go, Henry Peavy was ruled out immediately. First of all, he needed the job. He liked Mr. Taylor, and he also needed him to appear on his behalf in court later that day. Plus, Peavy seemed very, very distraught. He had to clean up the crime scene in front of the reporters. He was running around the apartment complex, getting rid of bloody rags, saying, if I could get my hands on whoever killed Mr. Taylor, I would gladly spend the rest of my life in jail. But what reporters did to Henry Peavy is outrageous. two men from William Randolph Hearst's Los Angeles Examiner actually kidnapped Peavy from his apartment and held him captive for over 12 hours without food. They kept him in his offices until late at night, where they brought him here to the cemetery. They had two other people in the distance waiting, one using his voice like a ghost, and another person, swear to God, holding up a white sheet, trying to scare a confession out of Peavy, or at least get him to say he knows who did it. Well, Peavy found the whole thing hysterical. He was like, "What are you doing? Do you really think I'm this dumb? Plus, your ghost doesn't have a British accent. Mr. Taylor does." Well, Thomas Woolwine was furious at Hearst, at the Examiner, and the NAACP even filed a lawsuit, but it was eventually dropped, and nobody questioned Henry Peavy again. All eyes, of course, were on Mabel Normand. I mean, she was at the bungalow the night of the murder, but for now, she was on the back burner. Instead, the focus was on the man who had Henry Peavy's job before him, Edward Sands, which was actually an alias. He was born Edward Fitzgerald Snyder in Marion, Ohio, and at age 17, he left home, lied about being 18, and enlisted in the United States Navy. Once in the Navy, he caused all sorts of problems. He embezzled, stole from them, and even took one of their cars, saying, "If you want it, you gotta come find me." Well, the following year, 1920, going by Edward Sands, he got the job as Taylor's personal valet. Then, the following year in 1921, that July, in what would be his last summer alive, Taylor took a trip to Europe and left Sands behind to take care of everything at the bungalow on Alvarado. Well, he certainly took care of everything. He stole from Taylor, he forged checks, he wrecked his car, and he completely disappeared. Then, in a very bold move, he joined the U.S. Coast Guard with a warrant out for his arrest, but he didn't get caught. A couple months later, in December, just 2 months before the murder, Taylor's apartment was robbed. The kitchen door had been pried open, and Taylor came home to find his possessions gone, as well as his case of cigarettes, but not just any cigarettes, a specific brand of gold-tipped cigarettes. 2 weeks later, Taylor receives an envelope in the mail that contained a receipt from a pawn shop from Northern California. Sands had hawked Taylor's jewelry and sent him a receipt signed William Cunningham Dean Tanner. This was his real name, and also Taylor's biggest secret. Was Sands trying to scare him, threaten him, blackmail him? Well, after the murder, the clerk from the pawn shop identified Sands as the one who hawked the jewelry, so we know for sure that Sands committed the robbery. But does this mean he pulled the trigger? Well, you would certainly think, based on the eyewitness accounts of several people who said they saw Sands lurking around Alvarado the day and the night of the murder. One man told police exactly where he saw Sands standing, and when they checked out the area, they found gold-tipped cigarette butts on the ground. Then Fait MacLean's maid remembered hearing footsteps outside the window prior to the murder. So when police checked the alleyway outside the window, they found gold-tipped cigarettes. This doesn't necessarily mean Sands was the murderer. He could have been lurking around plotting another robbery. Police were also certain that the man who killed Taylor was the man who Fait MacLean saw outside his door, and she swore up and down that it wasn't Sands, and she should know. She knew Sands. He worked for Taylor. He was constantly around. Not only that, there was a gas station attendant who was working around the corner on Alvarado who says that a man, matching Fait MacLean's description of the motion picture burglar, said he was inside the gas station asking for directions to Taylor's apartment right before the murder. Sands wouldn't have had to ask for directions. He knew exactly where Taylor lived. Well, despite all of this, Sergeant King still wanted to talk to Sands, so he issued a warrant for his arrest, and a nationwide manhunt ensued. But Sands was never found, never heard from again, and What happened to him is just as mysterious as to what happened to Taylor. From one cemetery to another cemetery, we're now a half hour away from where we just were in Altadena's Mountain View Cemetery. There has been so much written about this case, books, websites, blogs. In fact, if you really want to do a deep dive or learn more about this story, you have to check out the best of the best, Taylorology. It's a website run by a man named Bruce Long, who has been following this case for decades, and he's assembled so much information and newspaper clippings. He has copies of the testimonies, witness statements, photos, really fascinating stuff. He's the master professor of all of this. He also pretty much fact checks all these books that have been written and can offer proof as to why things are correct or not. His site is just brilliant. But with all the information he has, there are still theories. And people have mixed up a lot of facts with speculation, and it's hard to weave through it all. But what everyone seems to be in agreement on is that famous players Lasky had crucial evidence removed from Taylor's bungalow as his body laid before everyone scrambling around him. They took the bootleg liquor, of course, but they also round up a lot of letters that had been sent to Taylor, romantic love letters. Also, I mentioned that Taylor had some friends there doing damage control as well. Well, one of them was George Hopkins. George was a set designer and a production designer who started his career in 1917. Not only did he work with Taylor, but according to Hopkins, he was in an intimate relationship with Taylor. He was very open about it in later years and even wrote an unpublished autobiography, which was a source for one of the books about this murder. But George wasn't just any set designer. Long after Taylor's murder, he went on to be Academy Award nominated 13 times, winning 4 Oscars for A Streetcar Named Desire, My Fair Lady, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and Hello, Dolly. He also did Casablanca, Mildred Pierce, Strangers on a Train, A Star is Born, East of Eden, Auntie Mame, The Music Man, and on and on and on. But on the morning of Taylor's murder, he too was scrambling around the apartment collecting things. What? Nobody really knows. There had been some mumblings in the press that Taylor had been seen at underground gay clubs in LA, but there wasn't really much proof, so it didn't get much traction. Instead, the press made sure its readers knew that Henry Peavy was gay. They outed him, and they also said they had reason to believe that Edward Sands was gay as well. Again, it was all hearsay, and there was very little proof. George Hopkins certainly wasn't going to confess they were lovers back then. So instead of going down the gay route, investigators were more concerned with what famous players Lasky had gotten rid of this morning, and what the deal was with this pink nightgown and handkerchief with the monogrammed initials MMM. Mary Miles Minter may have never even been such a strong suspect had she just played it much cooler. In the late spring of 1921, after a brief stay at the Ambassador Hotel, which actually stood about 1,000 feet from here, Mary, her sister, her mother, and her grandma all moved from one opulent mansion to another, and it is staggering how much this house has retained its appearance because this neighborhood has not. The 20,000 square foot, 40-room mansion was built in 1911, and unlike their Fremont Place mansion, this one, just a few minutes away, sits right out in the open for anyone to walk by. It's been home to war veterans, unwed mothers, a few different purposes, but now it serves as a children's study center. But Charlotte Shelby owned it from 1921 to 1932. When they moved in here a year before William Desmond Taylor's murder, Mary was a huge star. Anne of Green Gables was a hit, and Mary and Mr. Taylor were, of course, thrilled. They even went on to make a few movies together. Mary, she must have also been thrilled that he only lived a few minutes away because she had fallen in love. I think the best word to describe Mary was delusional. She apparently fell so hard, so deep, so recklessly for him that it caused major problems between her mother and her. Charlotte was furious over it and didn't even want her daughter in the same room as Taylor. Charlotte even went as far as to threaten famous Lasky players and demanded they never set him to direct Mary in anything again. They obliged Charlotte by giving Taylor that head of production promotion. Win-win for everyone. Well, a win-win for everyone but Mary, who was a mess on the morning of Taylor's murder. After finding out that he'd been shot, she got in her car and raced to Alvarado Street. She pushed through the reporters, the police, that whole mob scene that was there, and demanded to see Mr. Taylor. His body, though, had been taken to the funeral home already, so she answered a few quick questions here and there for the press, but she was so frantic and so dramatic, she beelined downtown to find him. She arrived at the Overholtzer funeral home, and she wasn't alone. A few reporters, struck by her very odd and dramatic behavior, just had to know where Mary was heading next, and they tailed her all the way there. She tore into the building, demanding to give blood to Mr. Taylor. She wanted them to take her blood out and put it in him. Mr. Overholtzer tried to explain that Mr. Taylor was dead, but Mary would not hear of it. She was in absolute hysterics. He had her come back the following day where she would be left alone with Mr. Taylor's corpse. It wasn't until touching his cold body that she realized he would not be coming back.
Yes, Mr. Taylor, is it here? Is it here? Yes, yes. Is it really the shot? It must be losing blood. But get him where I can lie down on the table. You pump the blood out into him. No, he said, I can't do that. I said, oh, you don't understand. This is my mate.
Yes.
You don't understand, Mr. Overholtzer. I have the right. I claim this man. He belongs to me. Now, many times you may think people are dead, but if you just take the right action, they'll come back. If you just stop arguing, Mr. Overholtzer, for God's sake, take me to him and put me on whatever is necessary and get the blood out of me into him. Who could have done this to me? They crucified Jesus. Now they crucified my mate.
Word of Mary's very dramatic behavior at the bungalow and at the mortuary got back to Sergeant King and Woolwine. They were not going to let that go without an investigation, but what could they do, though? They had no valid or even legal reason to bring Mary in until love letters from Mary to Mr. Taylor popped up. Now, how this happened is pretty complicated, but essentially, investigators were fed up with the film studios pushing them around, and famous players Lasky, who didn't want any headlines saying they were obstructing the investigation, agreed to return letters that they had confiscated the morning of the murder. Included were a stack of love letters from Mary to Taylor, as well as a stack to him from Mabel Normand. Well, the press loved this new angle. Now they had a love triangle. Also, sometime between Taylor's death and his funeral, newspapers reported that there had been a pink silky nightgown and a handkerchief with the letters MMM on it found in his home. Investigators now had enough reason to bring Mary in for questioning, which just happened to fall on the same day as Taylor's funeral, which Mary did not attend. Also that morning, one of the love letters that Mary had written to Mr. Taylor had been splashed all over the front pages. Now, Mary's mother, Margaret Shelby, tried to keep a very low profile and remained right here in this house while all of this was happening. She was reportedly furious at famous players Lasky for letting those letters get out, and furious at District Attorney Woolwine because she was friends with him. Some even say they had a romantic past, but that's all speculation. As much as Woolwine didn't want to depose Mary, he knew he had to. So on funeral day, Mary was taken downtown where she was questioned for several hours. It wasn't the same hysterical Mary from murder day. She was calm, she was collected, and She answered the questions matter-of-factly, almost as if she had been trained. She did admit she was in love with Taylor. She said they had never been intimate, but that he did love her back. She said that Mr. Taylor said he wanted to have a relationship with her, but couldn't because of their 30-year age difference. According to Mary, he didn't want her to spend the rest of her life loving him. This didn't stop Mary, though, from pining for him, and she even admitted that she had paid him a midnight visit in December, a few months before the murder. But it was Mary's testimony about her mother, as well as statements from other witnesses saying that Charlotte Shelby was so irate over her relationship, so irate that she had publicly and loudly threatened to kill Taylor if he got anywhere near her daughter. After Mary's questioning, Woolwine was like, see, she was so honest and forthright. She admitted the affair. Probably wasn't her. Let's move on. And King was like, no, we have to talk to her mother. Charlotte Shelby's days of laying low in this house had come to an end, and King had reason to question her, so he and a partner arrived here at the house one afternoon and found Charlotte with a handful of lawyers waiting for his arrival. Except he hadn't given her any indication. As she pseudo-welcomed him into this house, he realized who must have tipped her off. Woolwine, his own boss. Well, he couldn't have been too surprised when Charlotte refused to answer a few simple questions, simply saying, I have nothing to offer you. I can't help your case. I'm too busy. I'm about to leave for New York. I have no time to dedicate to your investigation. Well, he didn't press the matter any further, and he saw himself out. However, he was more convinced than ever that Edward Sands was no longer his number one suspect. This is so fun. There's a man painting downstairs. He said I could take a quick peek back here. We're in the back of the house, looking down into the courtyard now, which looks more like a children's playground than the former courtyard of one of film's biggest stars and now murder suspect. Fitting, though, because Mary Miles Minter, who was almost 20, still acted like a child. But the newspapers, they were loving every minute of this love triangle angle. It sold way more copies than anything having to do with Edward Sands and him being the suspect. A murder director, and he may have been involved with Mabel Normand and Mary Miles Minter, 2 movie stars? And how about this? Those 2 movie stars only lived 1 block from each other. Mabel's apartment has long been destroyed, but it sat down the hill right here from her love triangle cohort.
And went immediately to Mabel Normand. The papers had said that she was the last person seen alive. Oddly enough, our house was on the corner of 7th and Hampshire Street. On the edge of Colorado. Our house is still there, so it was after Hampshire. It is Vermont, 1 block below in Hampshire Street. And I think this was on the corner. There was a court, apartment court with a 1-story bungalow. And Mabel Normand lived in one of them. Mabel Normand was one of the few persons I had met in motion pictures who was sweet to me. I liked her. As I approached Mabel's house, some police, I noticed some men ahead of me, and they stopped me. What do I want? I want to see Miss Normand. Why? It was a great tragedy, and I understood that you were the last person to see me. You're a friend of hers? Well, I know her. I talked with her. I said, probably see her. No, not now. They started pushing me out the door, and she came to the head of the stairs. She said, who is it? And I said, it's Mary Miles Minter. She said, oh, Mary, come up the stairs. She said, it's all right. I told you I didn't want people, but she's all right. She was in some filming thing. And she started to take me into her bedroom. She said, no, let's go in the bathroom and we'll run the water. If they've got anything going, they can't hear our conversation as well. I said, I don't care. Mabel thought you know about this, do you know anything? She said, my God, Mary. And to my astonishment, she called him Bill. She said, Bill! Who could have had anything against Bill? I don't really remember what I said, except that try to think. She said, Mary, He worshipped the ground you walked on, and he poured out his heart to thee. That he wanted to do the right thing by you. That you were so young, but that he feared that you would love him all the days of your life, and that he loved you too. That he didn't want to hurt you. She asked me, I asked her, who, what, Mabel? Can you think of anyone? No, I can't think either. It is impossible. She said, where was he shot? I said, in his head. Oh my God. I said, Mabel, how could anyone have been shot in that position? But I think Mabel was a very outgoing, sincere person. I liked her very much.
Yes.
Hobart Avenue on the southern border of Griffith Park is kind of important to our story because it provided Mary with her alibi for the night of the murder. Not to complicate this story any further, but Charlotte had ordered renovations on the New Hampshire house. So on the actual night of Taylor's murder, Grandma, along with Mary and Margaret, stayed in a rental house 5 miles away here on Hobart, while Charlotte remained back at the mansion where we just were, overseeing the noisy and dusty renovations. The house that they rented here on Hobart, it was torn down the year after Taylor's murder, and in 1924, this house with the great red front door that now stands here was built. Well, it's definitely from the era, it's not the actual house. I still wanted to come here, though, and at least show you the street where Grandma had no problem talking to investigators. Unlike Charlotte, Grandma answered all of their questions very cooperatively. She stated that she went to bed around 9 o'clock and that her granddaughters stayed up reading downstairs. Margaret, she corroborated this story, telling investigators exactly what they were reading, where they were sitting. Their tight alibi was just yet another reason why Sergeant King really couldn't make any moves.